Funny thing about this is that it's probably one of the shortest books in the whole Bible. There are only 24 verses. In fact, it's so short it doesn't even get chapter numbers. And yet, it's 24 verses and every single one of them has caused argument or dissension down the years.
That it's so short has probably contributed to it being maybe one of the more overlooked books in New Testament scholarship, and even actually in the church. And there are a number of reasons for that, apart from it being so short and you not being able to get your teeth into it, really.
Well, start off. Jude, he claims to be a brother of James, who's a brother of Jesus. Well, it's clear from the Gospels that Jesus had brothers and sisters, 4 brothers and 2 sisters. But of course, a lot of Christians don't acknowledge that Jesus had brothers and sisters. So even the very title that he gives this book, "Here I am, brother of Jesus and James," causes trouble.
And in fact, if you look at the Greek, this guy, he is a guy, by the way, it's not short for Judith or something. This guy is actually not called Jude at all. So here's the Greek New Testament, verse 1 of Jude. It says, Judas Jesu Christou doulos adelphos de Jacobu. Judas, slave of Jesus Christ, brother of James. So Jude's name, according to the Greek Bible, the Greek rendering of his name is Judas.
So the starting line is Jude, or in Greek Judas, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. So he identifies himself by referring back to James, not saying that I'm the brother of Jesus, in a way very similar to the letter of James, who also claimed to be a servant of Jesus Christ and not the brother of Jesus Christ. So obviously, if these letters really go back to relatives of Jesus, then they keep their distance and don't make anything out of their closeness or being relatives.
But one obvious reason for not calling him Judas in English is that Judas, the name Judas doesn't go down too well because of Judas Iscariot. So in fact we give him the name Jude.
If you were the brother of Jesus, you'd tell people, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Would I tell people that I'm the brother of Jesus and try to get influenced by this? Because you can say, okay, I know him best and I'm very close to him. But as we know from the Gospels, the brothers of Jesus obviously didn't realize who he was during his lifetime and only came to faith in him after the events in Jerusalem with death and resurrection. And therefore, they had reasons not to be too proud of their knowledge of Jesus, because they obviously haven't followed him during his earthly career. And you know, there's this other opinion which is held mainly in the Catholic tradition, but I think there's it's a possibility which should be taken serious, that they are not full brothers of Jesus, but half brothers. So you know, within the Catholic tradition and the idea of Mary as a virgin, it's of course a problem if you have brothers and sisters of Jesus, especially if you take the line that these are younger brothers and sisters of Jesus, because then Mary was clearly perhaps a virgin at the beginning, but no longer at the end. So to get rid of this problem, you find the solution that this was actually the elder siblings of Jesus from a previous marriage of Joseph with an unknown wife, so that James and Jude and the others mentioned are actually elder kind of half-brothers. And this might be one of the reasons why they had problems, first of all with the second wife of his father, and again then with the son out of this liaison, which obviously behaved a little bit strange in their eyes.
Going around saying he was the son of God.
Yeah, you can imagine that you are not happy having a brother like this, and some forceful event is indeed necessary to convince you that your little brother, in this case, is really the Son of God.
Another way to get around this problem, if you hold to a doctrine of perpetual virginity, is to say that brothers doesn't really mean blood brothers, if you like, but they may be cousins or part of the wider family.
About Jude as a person, we know nothing more about the New Testament, besides what we know also about Paul, that he might be a member of the earthly community, of the first community in Jerusalem, because in the beginning of the book of Acts we have this reference that Mary and the brothers of Jesus belonged to the community, and that he traveled, that he did some preaching and missionary work, but otherwise we don't know much about him, and his letter also does not reveal a lot about him.
Perhaps another reason that Jude's been overlooked, perhaps in the church and in scholarship, is that it's quite negative. In fact, Jude sets out and he says, oh, I'm going to write you a letter, or I was going to write you a letter that's going to be all about salvation and about how great it is to have salvation in Jesus Christ. But I've heard these things and I turned instead to deal with them. So he has to write a different kind of letter to the one he intended. And the letter he writes in the end is quite negative in tone because it's addressing the problem of false teachers within the church.
He knows there's a whole load of problems in the churches, and the churches, there seems to be sort of rebellions in the churches. So people wonder, well, what sort of rebellions were they? And loads of people have tried to imagine what sort of problems they were. I actually think that they're problems over the fact that Christianity started off as the religion that broke all the social boundaries. And so there were slaves sitting next to masters, free people sitting next to people who are very rich, poor people, sick people, old people, Jews, Gentiles, men, women, and they were all expected to work together. Now, the problem with that is that in a highly stratified society, that is going to be explosive. And Jude seems to be very worried about that sort of explosion.
So I think it's interesting the way that the Bible has an influence on all sorts of things without us realising it sometimes. So in the mid-90s, when I was at school, there was a really popular album by a band, sort of trip-hop band called Portishead, and they had an album called Dummy, which was really popular. It won the Mercury Music Prize. There, on that album, on Portishead's Dummy album, there's a song called Wandering Star. And it's kind of a chilled out but quite melancholy tune. And it's got very poetic lyrics. And it was only recently that I realised that those lyrics are actually based directly on a verse in Jude. They're waterless clouds carried along by the winds, autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars for whom the deepest darkness has been reserved forever. And in the Portishead song Wandering Star, the chorus goes, wandering star, for whom it is risen, blackness, darkness forever. So directly from Jude, and bizarre in a way, because this is a text sort of condemning false teachers in the church, and yet it comes across on the Portishead album as a kind of almost an expression of the singer's kind of grief, if you like. So it's used in a completely different context. I don't even know if she knows Jude. I think in the sleeve notes, I was looking at the sleeve notes, and it says she thanks a friend of hers for the inspiration on Wandering Star. So maybe the friend gave her this verse from Jude, but an example of how the poetic elements of the Bible are taken up in all sorts of different places.
You want yet another bristly bit? Oh yes, well here, I'll give you another bristly bit. Can I read you another line?
So in verse 9 it says, but when the archangel Michael contended with the devil and disputed about the body of Moses, he did not dare to bring a condemnation of slander against him, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Jude is referring to a dispute between an archangel, Michael in this case, and the devil about the body of Moses. And this isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, but the point is Jude has had to use material that's not in the Old Testament to make this point. And is this a problem? So in Jude 14, again in reference to the false teachers, Jude saying, it was also about these that Enoch, in the 7th generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, see, the Lord is coming with tens of thousands of his holy ones. Now this is a quote taken not from the Old Testament, but from what's called some this is a quote taken not from the Old Testament, but from some other Jewish literature that's found in what's called the pseudepigrapha. So it's not canonical, it's not included in the Hebrew Bible, and it's a direct quote from a book called 1 Enoch.
Lots of Christians think that the Bible is perfect. The binding came from God as much as what's in between the binding. And so they make a very sharp distinction between the canon and what's outside the canon. But here's a book inside their canon quoting a book that they reject from their canon. It just goes to show that the early Christians didn't actually have a fixed canon. The canon as we have it is an invention of the 4th century, late 4th century, and it only becomes absolutely standardized with print.
There are a number of issues with using a text that's not in the Old Testament in the New Testament. It creates problems in lots of different ways.
Jude, 24 verses, as many problems. It will keep students and theologians in business for centuries to come.